Hey, welcome to Furthering Christendom. Today we're here with Kelly James Clark. We're going to talk about his new book, A Spiritual Geography of Early China. Is that the right title, Kelly?
Close. It's a spiritual geography of early Chinese thought.
There we go. Okay.
What you said is halfway true. We do try to have at least a start on a spiritual biography of early China, but I try to relate it as a philosopher to a kind of re-understanding of early Chinese thought.
This is coming out with Bloomsbury Press in about a month. Isn't that right?
Yeah, it should be out anytime.
Awesome. Really looking forward to this. But before we talk about your new book, you recently met Common, who
that is true. I wasn't expecting that question, but I'm going to close the door. I saw him in his first role on Broadway with Samuel L. Jackson and sorry, I take it back. I saw Samuel L. Jackson in another play with a whole bunch of people that no one else will know. But everyone knew him, and I think a lot of people went to see him. And I was as I was leaving the theater with my wife, there were people standing around, and anyway, I just started talking to them, and they were all waiting to meet the actors. And that, well, what the heck? I'm here. And I really like Hammond's demeanor, and I think some of his music is really powerful. And I didn't know this until after. Evidently, he's at least some kind of Christian, and I think he has a kind of Christian vision in some of the movies that he makes and some of the music that he makes. So, so I thought, well, I'll stick around. What the heck? I'm here.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I've been listening to him since I was like 13. So when I saw that on Facebook, I was a bit jelly, I must say.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get into the book. So let's talk first off, before we talk about kind of like the standard philosophical Chinese text. Let me ask a question about kind of like pre-Confucian world, right, in China.
Yeah.
What was it like? Was it broadly theistic, or was it atheistic? Take me to school. Talk to me here.
All right. So let me just say, I'm no expert, or was no expert on early Chinese thought. I had been to China a lot, and I went to China to have usually like Confucian Christian dialogues. And I went with a Society of Christian Philosophers. I organized for many years the Society of Christian Philosopher annual conference in China. And I decided that people who work in those areas we need to be listeners. Like the Christians would go and we'd try to talk everyone into being a Christian, but we didn't listen very well to what they were saying, what they believed, and what their culture taught. And I just thought, if you're going to have a dialogue, you have to be a good listener. And so I really dove into Chinese texts, and primarily Confucius, actually. And one summer I decided, and it just sort of hit me when I decided to do this, that Confucius said, I'm not an innovator, I'm a transmitter. And Confucius repeatedly says that he's transmitting a tradition that preceded Confucius. And we call it Confucianism, but Confucius himself would probably be unhappy that we gave a name to a tradition, that we gave his name to a tradition. He seemed to prize humility and to continually let people know that he didn't, that he was passing on a tradition. And this tradition is well over 1,000 years. It could be 2,000 years prior to Confucius, depending on how accurate the history is. So I decided to read the text that Confucius said influenced him. The Book of Songs, or the Book of Poetry is another name for it, or the Book of Documents. Some people call it the Book of History, but it really is more, it's just kind of government documents that precede him. the Spring and Summer Annals. And I read a little bit of the I Ching, but I actually don't think anymore that much of that precedes Confucius. Or there's probably some that precedes Confucius, but it's not that, it's quite different from what Confucius taught. So I don't know, we don't know what text he had or he talked about. By the way, we don't know much about Confucius. I'm kind of a Confucius skeptic. He probably existed, but we don't know much about Confucius. But at the time, I thought we knew a lot about Confucius, and we knew him from what his followers wrote in the Analects. And one of the things he wrote, I'm not an innovator, I'm a transmitter. So I decided to read these texts and see what they said. And when I read the text, even though I had heard from many scholars that China has no God, the Chinese aren't religious, I had heard this over and over again and believed it. I believed it because these people were experts. So I read lots of people who aren't theists or who don't believe what I believe. And so if Confucius wasn't a theist, no big deal. Anyway, that's what I believed until I read these early texts. And you can see in the handout, I have texts referring to the pre-Confucian God. And these are from the period within which Confucius lived is the Zhou period. There's a Zhou dynasty, roughly 1050 BC to roughly 250 BCE, and the Shang dynasty, 1600 to 1050 BCE. And these are the dynasties that Confucius refers to, and even earlier than that. He praises the early sort of mythic kings, Yao Shun and Yu, and they're probably 2000 BCE or further, maybe 2400. No one knows exactly. And this is what we read in these texts. And I put this handout up so people, because I'm going to read texts. I mean, this is all a text-based argument. It's not just me making things up. So I would read in these texts that Shang Di or Di, Di is really the name of God, the proper name of God in these early texts. And Shang Di is just like high God, another proper name for God. And later on, the term heaven, Tian, became another proper name for God. In fact, in the Zhou period, it becomes the preferred proper name for God.
Right.
And so what can Shangdi or Di or Tian, what do they do? Well, they send down disasters and approval on men below. So people make claims like the early Chinese don't even believe in transcendence. There's nothing above the human. Right. And well, here you have any number of these named deities sending down disasters on men below.
Right. And
they directly order rain, thunder, wind, and there are lesser gods in early China as well. There are gods of mountains and of rivers and of rain. There are evil beings above humans. And from the book of poetry, which is filled with material about the high God, says King Wen is on high, oh, he shines in heaven. This is after King Wen died, and King Wen is the great cultural exemplar in Confucius's documents. The one that we should emulate the most is King Wen. And what we read about him after he dies is he is on high. Well, where is he? Oh, he shines in heaven. So heaven's a place. It's a place above earth. It's a place where dead people go. At least virtuous dead people go. King Wen's there. Zhou is an old people, but it's charge or mandate. If you know Chinese thought, you know about the mandate of heaven. Right. That's the term mandate of heaven. Zhou received the mandate of heaven. King Wen was the first king of the Zhou dynasty. And the right to rule came from heaven. It came from God. God gave, it's like the divine right of kings. the Shang dynasty kings were wicked and corrupt, so God withdrew his favor from them and gave it to King Wen and the Zhou dynasty. So it's new. They're an old people, but now they have the mandate of heaven.
Right.
Land of Zhou becomes illustrious because of that. And it's illustrious because they were blessed by God's mandate. They were partly blessed because God recognizes justice and virtue, and kings that act in accord with justice, and rulers that act in accord with justice and virtue. So King Wen is in heaven. He ascends into heaven, and then he descends. Where is he? On God's left hand and on his right. So King Wen is in heaven and beside heaven. Heaven is also the proper name for God. So he's up in heaven and he's beside heaven. And then this is from the Book of Documents, and this is the first reference that we know of in Chinese history to the mandate of heaven, which is it's the foundational Chinese political document. You hear it all the way up to the 20th century. You even hear it a little bit in the 20th century as people are trying to, as Marxists are trying to remove themselves from anything religious. You still hear it. At any rate, this is the first reference to the mandate of heaven. It's from the Book of Documents. The fame of him ascended to the high God, the fame of King Wen. And his fame is because he's just and virtuous. And then, like, God sees this, it ascends to the high God, Shangdi, and God approved. Heaven gave a great charge to King Wen. The mandate of heaven gave the mandate to King Wen. What was the mandate? To exterminate the great dynasty of Yin, that's another name for the Shang dynasty, and to receive its great appointment. So the early Shang dynasty rulers had the mandate of heaven. They were virtuous, but they were vicious 300 years later, or well, you can see in the dates, almost 600 years later, they were vicious. By then, what did they do? They got drunk a lot. They spent a lot of time with concubines. That wasn't the big problem. They ignored the needs of their people. And so people were starving, and kings were going to war, and people were dying. And those are the really bad things. But King Wen didn't do that according to this. So God sees his virtue, transfers the divine right to rule to him. And then it says the various states belonging to it and their people were brought to an orderly condition. The Shang dynasty was in chaos. And when God exercises a kind of active providence in the world, and he does it through people. He removes the mandate of heaven from the Shang dynasty, gives it to King Wen, and brings goodness, like the kingdom of God, you might think, to the world. And so I read all this and I just thought, well, if that's the tradition Confucius is transmitting, then he's transmitting a theistic tradition.
Right.
And then once you begin to see this, and I started to read historians and not philosophers so much, China is a God-haunted world. It's a spirit-haunted world. It's an ancestor-haunted world. And the list could go on and on of all the sort of spirit. I say a spiritual biography of early China, but it's spirits. It's non-humans.
Right.
Non-physical human-like beings that are anthropomorphic beings that are having an influence on the world. And I saw it so clearly. And then I thought, then I decided maybe some of these great authorities here, Marcel Grenet up the top, Chung Fen-Yu and Roger Ames, who say there's no God in China, maybe these authorities aren't right.
Right.
And not right in their understanding of Confucius. And that's when I began to look at the Analects differently.
Right. No, I mean, when I was in China, living there and teaching there, I remember many times when I would hear from, there's one time I was guest lecturing at a university, and I was lecturing on the first way, Aquinas' first way, Aristotle's unmoved mover. And in response, one of the students was like, no, we don't believe in God in China. Like, this is foreign, this is your like Western idea and so forth. And we were kind of going back and forth on this, and I was pulling from your work. And this wasn't the only conversation that I had.
No, you hear it everywhere.
You hear it anytime I bring up God. We don't believe in God in China, and it's just like really amazing how some of the texts that you reference just completely go overlooked. And when I bring up those textual evidence from your work, it's kind of like a lot of people aren't sure what to do with that exactly. So let's talk about
Yeah.
Confucius, for example. There's
Yeah.
a couple places in Confucius where heaven Tian endows one with virtue, or God's going to judge, that sort of thing. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So the main thing I think to keep in mind is that Confucius doesn't write in a vacuum, and he's not inventing some sort of philosophy. That he is part of a tradition that he identifies with. It's the tradition of primarily of King Wen and the Zhou, and I've already shown, I think, and you can show it even more. There are hundreds of passages in these texts. I just gave you a few of them. A few that I think are really interesting, but there are hundreds of them in these texts. So that's my biggest argument. This is what Confucius is transmitting. And so when he talks, this is a really famous passage from Confucius. It's like his autobiography in the Analects. At 15, I set my mind on learning. At 30, I took my place in society. At 40, I became free of doubts. At 50, I understood heaven's mandate. At 60, my ear was attuned. At 70, I could follow my heart's desires without overstepping the bounds of propriety. And here's heaven's mandate. And how are we supposed to take this as the early tradition did, as something like the divine right of kings?
Right.
And actually, what I show in another paper is that everyone has their own mandate. Like it's not just a political mandate, but each person has something like a calling, like a mandate is a calling. And so as an example, when King Wen died, there was competition for who would be the next king. And the most just, wise person in the kingdom was the Duke of Zhou. And King Wen's closest descendant was maybe an 8 or 9-year-old boy, his closest blood relative. Child. He was the Duke of Zhou was King Wen's brother, and the Duke of Zhou. There's several passages, and actually, the Duke of Zhou is even more important than King Wen, because the Duke of Zhou sees as his mandate to be the advisor to the king, not to be the king. And so I think there are two senses of heaven's mandate, that everyone has heaven's mandate. I mean, kings have it for sure, like something like the divine right of kings, but every person has it in these early Confucian texts. You have your place, you have your role.
That's right.
And it's your job to live up to that role. And so everyone has it. Confucius had it, and Confucius's mandate was not to be a king. His role was like the Duke of Zhou's. It was to be an advisor to kings. That's what Confucius thought. But it meant for him to live virtuously, doing what he was supposed to do. And so that's the first thing that struck me. And then you read things like, heaven has endowed me with virtue. I mean, the most important thing you could become was virtuous in Confucianism. And he thinks it was a gift from God. I began to think maybe this is literal. And then it goes on. He has been threatened by Huan Tui, and people are saying, well, don't you fear this? Don't you want to get out of here? Don't you want to save your butt? And he says, well, look, not only has heaven endowed me with virtue, I think heaven's going to take care of me. So Confucius had I think, a sense in this of divine providence.
Right, exactly.
the master had an audience, and again, you should think if he's transmitting the Joe tradition that that he believes in divine providence, because that's a theme that's widely repeated in the pre-Confucian texts.
Right.
The master had an audience with Nanzi, and Zilu was not pleased. The master swore an oath saying, if I've done anything wrong, may heaven punish me, may heaven punish me. Then again, you can take things like this as like an atheist saying, God forbid, and not really believing it. But given the background that of belief that a personal high God was a punisher and a rewarder, an anthropomorphic personal high God, then I think the natural way to take it is that he actually fears that. Now, he doesn't fear this. I think he thinks he hasn't done anything wrong. So, but if he has, he's saying, look, then God will punish me. So the master was surrounded in Kwang. He said, now that King Wen is gone, is not culture now invested here in me? So this is a word play, by the way. Wen in King Wen. Wen means culture. King Wen had a different real name, but he got an honorific name probably after he died. And Wen means culture. So he's the culture king, and culture is becoming the entire kind of person you're supposed to be. Virtue is the most important, but it also means being courageous, which might mean being in battle. It means writing poetry. A cultured person is someone that might write poetry or drop some pearls of wisdom now and then. Might be good with a bow and arrow. So culture is pretty widely understood here. But he's saying, look, it hasn't God invested culture in me like the thing King Wen got. If heaven intended this culture to perish, it would not have given it to those of us who live after King Wen's death. Since heaven did not intend that this culture should perish, what can the people of Kwang do to me? Again, here's heaven portrayed with intentions and plans and desires, and working to fulfill them. So we get, again, I don't know what else to say about ascribing personal properties like intention and will, desire, goodness, and then in this case, providence. Then what can the people of Kwang do to me? If God wants this, if God is with us, who can be against us? I think is roughly what he's saying. And heaven is widely portrayed. Heaven is portrayed as widely knowing, even of our inner thoughts and motives in Analects 9:12. And Yao was the. Many people say that the standard of goodness for community was the exemplar of the Zhou dynasty. And I just think they're not looking hard enough to see who the model is. So here we read in the Analects, how great was Yao as a ruler? He was this, Yao Shun and Yu were these great early, probably mythic kings from around 2000 BC, but there were stories that grew up around them. And the master's agreeing, oh yeah, he was majestic. But then he says, it is heaven that is great, and it was Yao who modeled himself upon it. So vast. And then he goes on about how great he was. But my point is the moral standard is not Yao. Yeah. It's not humans. It's not some ideal human community. Right. It's heaven. That's right. And ideal human communities are just mirroring the goodness that's in heaven. When they are ideal, they're usually not. But Confucius writes about and commends when they were as, you want to see how to live? Well, live like Yao. Why is Yao so great? Well, he modeled himself on heaven. That's right. That's right. Anyway, I don't have all the passages here. There's 17 texts in the Analects. And I think they all are best understood within the context of his tradition. Right, but he's transmitting. It's theistic. Yeah,
That's right. That's right.
yeah,
And then you also bring in cognitive science of religion a bit as well to kind of help develop your hermeneutic to interpret Confucius. Can you speak to that
yeah.
briefly?
Yeah, my last book was called God and the Brain, and I look at a lot of cognitive science of religion. And cognitive science of religion looks at how, because religion, belief in God, or various acts, often represented by belief in God. There are all sorts of things religion represents. There are rituals that we do, for example, that cognitive science of religion studies, but but it makes you think that it would be very unlikely that there would be a vast cultural exception to belief in God. That's one thing that I started doing. So I wrote a paper with my co-author of the book. Actually, we wrote a paper together um, on supernatural punishment theory. And supernatural punishment theory is a theory in the cognitive science of religion that says successful early human communities, and these are usually post-agricultural communities. So early, until around 10,000 BC, early human groups were kin groups of, well, no one knows exactly, but say 40 to maybe 150, but pretty small, mostly kin groups. And with the advent of agriculture, human communities, the size of them exploded. And then what is it that kept human communities together when early humans, well, all humans are not all that nice. You know, if you're hungry and there's no sheriff, you know, it's easy to just go and take it from somebody who you call an enemy. Or if there's a woman that you want to have, you go and have your way with that woman. If there's no, early human communities did not have a policing system, they didn't have a government, you know, they didn't have the legislative, the executive, and the other one, yeah, judicial. They didn't have that. So, I mean, they did monitor themselves, but what would happen is you might just ban somebody who
Mhm.
didn't live up to it. But when communities got big, you had to know who you could trust. And so the theory is that, and it's one that's used to explain what's called the puzzle of human cooperation, is that early human groups that were successful were ones that had a belief in a high, punishing, moralizing God, a God who punished the wicked and who rewarded the righteous, or at least that people believed in that. And so, and the basic idea is this God would know what you were doing when other people weren't looking.
Right.
And that meant you didn't have to, if people believed in this, and then there were ways people tried to, you tried to see if you could trust that people believed in that. But early human communities that had belief in a high, moralizing, providential God punishes the wicked, rewards the righteous, those communities were able to solve the puzzle of cooperation. Because if you believe that, it's never rational for you to do something wrong. Even if nobody's looking, it's never rational for you to do it because God's going to catch you. That's the rough idea. And so it would be very odd if this theory were true, if there was a huge cultural exception in that
Right.
China. So when I was at Oxford on a sabbatical, I went to this grad student's PhD defense on lesser gods in early China. And I really like to talk a lot, because not only are there higher gods, there are lower gods. And not only is there a high God, there's all sorts of in-between gods and then ancestors. And I wasn't used to people defending that. I was used to hanging around philosophers. This guy was a historian. And anyway, we decided to write a paper on, I decided to see if we could vindicate the supernatural punishment theory hypothesis in China. Because whenever people wrote about it, they would always say, well, it's probably true, but what about China? China has no God. People
Right.
would say that
Right.
all the time. And I thought, all right, well, let's check China. And so what we did was we he taught Chinese language at Oxford for 3 years. Now he teaches at Cambridge. He's an expert in the Chinese language.
Right.
So we did a database search of all the pre-Confucian texts, all the Warring States texts, which are really, they're all from roughly around 150 BC. There's about 30 texts from around 150 BC, including all the ones that I've cited already, including the Analects. We did a search where we looked at punishment, reward, Shangdi, Di, Tian, knowing. We looked at all the different parts of the supernatural punishment theory, broke it into parts,
Uh-huh.
and then we looked at intersections. And then we did a textual analysis. And we found out, guess what? Early Chinese texts vindicate supernatural punishment theory.
Right.
There are some texts that don't address it much, but there are surprising texts that do. I'll just give you an example. Lao Tzu's, or Lao Tzu, some people say, the Tao Te Ching, people say, oh, that's a Taoist text. It's an atheistic text. Well, the last 10 chapters of the Tao Te Ching have supernatural punishment theory. They have a God that cares for people. They have providence. That it's like once you see it,
Right.
I'll tell you this, once you see it and you read the last 10 chapters in a way that's different from the first 38 or whatever they are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Once I tell you that and you see it, you can see, oh, that part's really different. The first part, whoever or wherever those texts came from, there's something really different going on in the last part of it. Anyway, we found it in virtually every text, and we found it in a lot in some texts. And we found that some people say that Tian becomes more naturalistic, that Shangdi and Di, okay, the early Chinese, some of them did believe in a God, but not by Confucius, not Tian. Tian is a natural force for good. We actually found Tian is the most punishing and the most rewarding. So Tian doesn't fit this narrative of Tian as a natural force. Heaven is a personal, high moral God that exercises providence, and heaven, references to heaven in this regard are more prevalent than references to Di and Shangdi. So we find increasing supernatural punishment theory in the text, not decreasing supernatural punishment theory. So that was the first sort of foray into that. I also have a chapter on, I got a grant with my, small grant with my co-author to look at afterlife beliefs in early China. I want to look at two things with that. One is that it's widely stated the Chinese don't believe in an afterlife, and that isn't true.
Yeah.
It's widely stated the Chinese don't believe in heaven and hell. Both of those are untrue. They have different names. Well, not heaven is the best translation. They can have different names, but people can go down. And if you go down, it's bad. If you go up, it's good. When you die, so I spent a lot of time reading tomb texts and looking at architecture and looking at paintings to see what people likely believed. And there's a famous painting of the wife of a marquis where the wife dies. And so there's a painting in the very middle, it's her regular life. And then there's a painting in the top where she's on a dragon flying to heaven. And then underneath it, there's a possibility there's an underworld, which she avoids.
Right.
That painting was on the wall next to her tomb. There's people set out, if you're rich, your tomb has rooms. So you get out of your casket and the thought is that I'll get to this, what gets out. But you get out, and then you have a conference with the God who looks over your whole life and decides if you've been naughty or nice.
Right.
And so there's a recorder of your deeds, and and they're read, and then they're the ones that decide if you're suited to go on into the afterlife. And
Right.
well, who is you that goes on? And this was another thing I wanted to look at. In Cognitive Science of Religion says that we're natural born dualists. We're
Right.
kind of natural born theists, but we're natural born dualists, that we think it's natural for us to think that we have two parts, a body
Right.
part and a soul part. And I actually found out the Chinese believe in, or early Chinese, there are texts that, so the thing you have to think is, there's no discussion like there is in Plato of a pre-existing soul and then one that goes on after you die. There's not a big discussion by anybody of these views, but they're implied in what
Right.
people
It seems to be
believe.
assumed. Yeah.
And there's a few things where people talk about how we have a soul or a spirit, actually that we have two. One stays in your body. So there's your body, and then there's a spirit that stays in your in the tomb.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of rituals that early Chinese have is to try to keep that person in the tomb, because that's that part of you, that non-physical part of you, can come out and become a ghost and wreak havoc in the world. So a lot of what people call ancestor worship is really ancestor, I call it appeasement, that you're just trying to keep them in the grave and keeping from meddling in your affairs. But there's also the hope that this other part of your soul will go to heaven.
Right.
And so I looked at, used Cognitive Science of Religion to look at afterlife beliefs, but also to kind of look at the metaphysics of persons.
Uh-huh.
And anyone who says that the Chinese aren't dualists,
Right.
again, are just mistaken. That just,
And
there probably are some that weren't, but not very many, I would guess.
and this doesn't even get to, the recent book on religious cognition in China, somewhat recent book. But I mean, the idea that humanity, right? We're all the same. We all see teleology, right? We're all into promiscuous teleology. If we've evolved, if Barrett Guthrie's are right, we've all evolved to be sensitive to agency, and we all have a theory of mind. And so it just seems really weird, really strange if for some reason China is an exemption, right, to the kind of general facts about humanity and who we are as human beings.
Yeah.
So I think that's quite strong. And then the idea that Confucius was a transmitter, I think that as well is and the culture that he's transmitting is a theistic one. So and then you go on to argue in your volume as well, right, that this isn't just in the Analects. This is also in post-Confucian texts as well. It's not like it just immediately evaporates, once Confucius died.
It actually gets, you see it even more and more clearly, I think, in post-Confucian texts, and issues are discussed. You mentioned that that book that
Religious Cognition in China.
Years ago. What's the name of it?
The Religious Cognition in China one.
Yeah. My former student was Justin Barrett, who is a pioneer in cognitive science of religion. And he and I, prior to that book, got a Templeton grant to train Chinese psychologists in cognitive science of religion. And so Justin had never even been to China. So my job was to find Chinese psychologists who could do it. And every Chinese psychologist that I talked to, and I also talked to a couple of philosophers who did experimental philosophy, every single one said, well, you're not going to find religion here. The Chinese aren't religious. And so we got a grant. We brought a group of them to Oxford and trained them for 3 weeks. We did a 3-week training session, and we did the first experiments in China in cognitive science of religion. And the first one we did was promiscuous teleology.
Right.
And it's really interesting. So I thought, well, let's just see if we can replicate some standard views here. And Deb Kellerman, who's done the work in the United States, we decided to replicate. She's a friend of mine. We decided to replicate some of her studies. So we worked with the people we had in China, and we had to translate the English phrases that they had. We had to translate those into Chinese, and then you translate them back to see how well they hit your target. Well, it's very hard to China is more an idea language. It's not phonetic. And so it was really hard getting the translations right. So that was one of the studies we did. And another one, and the very first one published in China, was on afterlife beliefs in China. And the people who conducted the study in China were atheists who said Chinese don't believe in an afterlife. Again, it would be a phenomenal cultural exception.
Right.
So here's the thing. After 100 years of force-fed atheism in China, the Chinese believe in an afterlife. And they were totally shocked. They vindicated they were dualists and they believed in an afterlife. And they did this with students in China. So they were totally shocked. And in the implicit teleology studies, those are vindicated as well. There was not a single study that we did, including all the ones in that book. I was supposed to contribute something on afterlife for that book, but my co-author couldn't finish his part in time, so the book was published without it. At any rate, every single study in there showed that the Chinese are religious in just the same ways that we are. I mean, the same basic ways. Cognitive science of religion doesn't say that culture doesn't play huge roles. That doesn't mean that the Chinese are all Christians in the way, say, most Americans are. It just means the Chinese have the Chinese, like everyone else, are inclined to belief in God. Like everyone else, they're inclined to dualism. And unless someone disinclines them, and here's a way to disincline people, threaten their livelihoods, put them in prison, which is what happened under the Cultural Revolution, then you might expect people not to believe. It's not, these aren't ineluctable cognitive faculties. They're ones that, for a lot of people, the beliefs produced are skin deep, and so they're not so hard to overcome. But the underlying faculties are deep. That's what figure out.
Well, Kelly, thanks so much for coming on. This is fascinating discussion. I really loved your book. I definitely encourage everyone to go check it out. Ask your library to order it or buy it, and really, I think very interesting things. So thanks very much, Kelly, for coming on.
All right, thank you, and good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Yeah, take care.